Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to true seams. If you're unsure what the words truing or to true a seam mean, then I do recommend that you watch my What Is tutorial, where I explain the terminology truing or to true a seam. In this video, it's going to be a how-to. I'm going to show you a couple of different methods for truing seams together, for matching the stitching lines on patterns, making sure that they measure the same amount, and the rules that you need to follow. We're also going to be looking at blending curves and smoothing lines to make sure that you don't get any troughs or peaks in the pattern joins. So lots of things for us to cover. I'm going to be working with my free Copen pattern. You can work with any pattern of your choice. It really doesn't matter, and I would recommend truing a pattern if you make any alterations to it. You may also be working with a block or sloper and have designed your own patterns. And again, the same rules apply. So collect up your supplies and we can begin. Whenever you make changes to a pattern, be it to amend the pattern to make it fit your individual figure better, or perhaps change design lines, you will need to what's called true the pattern. True the seams, true the darts, any other design lines, to check that everything fits together properly while you're sewing the garment together. Now, whenever you're truing a garment, you're always going to be working with the stitching line. So if you're working with an already existing pattern, it may have the seam allowances already added, in which case I would recommend drawing your stitching line onto the pattern. Now, I'm working with this blue line here, because on my Copen pattern, my seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimetres. So I would need to measure that amount in from all of the edges, and you can see the red hashed lines that I have added here. However, you may also be working with a sloper or a block and have designed your own patterns, in which case you may not have seam allowances added yet and will actually be abutting the edges of the pattern together instead. The key is to remember to always work with the stitching line, because that's what we care about. So what would happen if you didn't true your seams together or true your darts together? Well, you may find there is a discrepancy in the seam. This would mean that the seams would be a different length, the dart legs would perhaps be a different length, and then for when you were sewing the garment together, you would have to ease the seams together. This might therefore cause you a problem by there being excess ease in a seam. It may look gathered, it may look puckered, or it may just make the garment hang and the fabric to hang incorrectly. So it's really important that you do true your seams together when you make any adjustments to a pattern, or if you designed your own pattern before you actually make the garments. So we're going to start by looking at two main methods that I use when truing my seams together. If you want to know how to true darts, then I have a separate tutorial for that, and I will link that here. So when it comes to truing the seams, we are going to be measuring the stitching lines. There are two methods that I generally use. The first one is to simply measure the stitching lines. It's common sense, really. So you would take a ruler and you would measure the stitching lines. I've drawn mine on with Sharpie. You would need to draw yours on with a sharp pencil, because Sharpie is inaccurate. It's too thick of a line. But I'm doing that so that you can see this clearly here. And I would measure the straight lines with a ruler. So perhaps a shoulder, I could measure that, and I would measure my front shoulder. I would also measure my back shoulder, and I would check that they measured the same amount. Now, if you're working with any curves, be that a curved neck, a curved armhole, a princess seam, the ruler isn't going to help you. You need a tape measure. You can actually get bendy rulers here, which you might find useful. I tend to use my tape measure. And you're going to position the tape measure on its edge, on its side, so that we're taking a really nice accurate measurement here. And you would work your way, if I was measuring between the top and the notch, I would position my tape measure on and I would simply pivot that, working my way down. Perhaps I go a little bit further to show you. Just working my way down the seam, holding it approximately 1.5 inches, 4 centimetres apart, to make sure that I'm being really accurate, holding it firmly in position. I also tend to position, whether I'm working with inches or centimetres, I'll position the markings down onto the line, because then it makes it easy for me to be able to peer over and see, oh, okay, that is 2 3/4, or that is 5.5 centimetres. Now, as well as measuring, the other method that I actually use most often is something that I like to call walking the seams together. The key here is that we're going to be matching the stitching lines together. Now, if you were working with a pattern that didn't have seam allowances, it's really easy to walk the seams together. You would actually just abut the edges of the paper, and because you had no seam allowances, and you would just pivot it around, just like so. However, I have seam allowances. The 2 red marked lines, they are my seam allowances, so I need to position my stitching lines together. In this case, there are 2 sort of methods that I use. The first one is to fold back the seam allowances on one side and to position the stitching lines one on top of each other. And then you would work your way around pivoting the stitching lines together. However, this is a little bit tricky for a curve. It's fine on a straight seam, but on a curve you do end up sort of having to force the paper underneath, and I find that a little bit tricky. But you know, up to you, depends what you find with your patterns. So the method that I often like to do is a method where I'm actually looking through the pattern. So I would line up the starting edge and I would work my way along, checking that one line was on top of the other line. And I'm actually looking through here. So I'm checking what I can see through the paper. However, this is difficult when you have got a thick paper. It would probably have been fine with this paper had I not added another section. I've got another bit of paper stuck on there because I've made amendments to this pattern. And it depends on the paper you're using. I draft on dot and cross paper or plain pattern paper, and that is a little bit see-through, so you can see the lines that you're working with. But this is thicker paper that I've had my patterns printed on at a print shop. Therefore, it isn't as easy to see through. So I might have to go back to this method, or probably on a curve, what I would do is my measuring method. So all of the methods are interchangeable. It depends what you're measuring, how easy your paper is to work with, and the method that you like the best. The key is that you need to remember to true your seams. It doesn't matter which method you use. So I've traced off the pattern onto this paper. This is what I would normally use, this plain pattern cutting paper or a dot and cross paper. It is finer than the paper that you get from the print shops, so it does mean that I can see through it, and you can see the lines of the stitching lines through the paper. So when it comes to matching or truing your seams, you need to make sure that you true the entire seam, from the bottom to the top, or the top to the bottom, it doesn't matter. But you need to make sure that the whole length of the seam is checked. So in this case, I might start from the bottom. Now I could use any of the methods that I showed you, but I'm going to be positioning the stitching lines on top of one another because this is the method that I use most often. And hopefully you can just about see that I can see through the line. I've drawn my lines this time in biro, not quite as accurate as pencil, but they will do better than my big Sharpie lines. And I'm going to work from the bottom up to the first notch. Now the notches are positioned on the seams as matching points. They're simply placed so that you can match an area. So if the notch doesn't match up, you need to change it. You would take your pencil and you would mark a new notch. It doesn't really matter where they are positioned. You may find that the designer has positioned them in a certain location. For example, here on a princess seam, I have positioned them over the curve of the bust because this is where any ease would happen or any difference between my seams would happen. On the side seam, I would normally position them along the waistline, but it depends on the designer. The key is that they are matching points. So you would check that they were in the right place. And obviously if you're the designer here and you haven't got your seam allowances added, you would just be abutting the stitching lines together and then marking your notches on. Once you get to the first notch, we would then work our way up to match the second notches. And what I tend to do with this method of positioning one piece of paper on top of the other is that I pivot it. So I'll hold the 2 pieces of paper down and I'll give a sort of soft grip here. So I'm holding them but not really firmly, allowing me to pivot the top piece of paper to match up the two lines, one on top of each other. And then I will do this again. And I will keep doing this until I have worked all the way around the curve. I'm pivoting, and then I'm moving my finger onto the next part that matches, and then I'm pivoting again. Moving my finger onto the next part that matches. Now here it seems that my notches are off slightly. So I would grab a pen and I would make sure that they were correct. And it's up to you really which you copy across. I could copy the one on the bottom across, or I could take the one on the top across. It's really up to you and the position that you want your notches to be in. Then I would match from the notch to the armhole. And that's what I would do for all of the seams. You need to check that they all match. Now you may find that there is ease incorporated in a seam. If you are working with an already existing pattern, it should have the words ease written on the seam. This is quite common for princess seams. It's also quite common in a back shoulder to be larger than a front shoulder. You may find it in an elbow area of a sleeve. The key is, if it says that it has ease incorporated, I would recommend that you find out how much the pattern had incorporated before you made any changes. So if perhaps you lengthened and shortened the sleeve, you would want to work out how much ease was in the elbow area before you lengthened or shortened your sleeve, and make sure that you had the same amount after you have done the adjustment. Now I want to show you this closer up because I want you to be able to see what I'm looking at. So I've drawn my line in Sharpie again, so it's really clear. And I would position one layer on top of the other, matching the notches here. We're going to be checking the notch to notch area. And I'm working my way along. Can you see that the line is underneath? So this part matches, finger goes on, then I loosely let the top layer move. And then I say, well, it matches up to this point. Finger goes on, and then I pivot that top layer again. It matches up until here. Again, firm finger, and I keep using that to work my way up until I get to the match where I have moved my notches. So what happens if you work your way all the way up from the bottom to the top, or whichever way you're doing it, of the seam? Perhaps it's just between the notch and the top area here, and the seam is out. What do you do? Well, it depends by how much it's out by. If the seam is out by a very small amount, and perhaps it's in this key area from the notch to the top edge, then what I would tend to do is to pick the middle point, and I would blend back in the middle of the two differences. So I have got one here and one here, and I'm going to pick the middle point of the two, and we will blend that. Now, one thing to think about here is you might find that the seam is out by a small amount or by a large amount, and it may make you realise you forgot to move the leg of the dart, or you might remember something. So first of all, think about, have you done anything wrong? You know, is there anything you can think about that means that this seam is out? But it also might just be out because of an alteration, or if you're drafting from scratch, it might also be out. So it's not really a problem, you just need to learn to correct it. So I will grab my French curve here, and I will try and find a curve that hits the two lines at the middle point where they join. And I would simply draw in my new curve. Now I've chosen to go with the midpoint, but for a small amount, you could actually choose to go for the higher one or the lower one. It doesn't really matter. All you would need to do afterwards is, because you've amended your armhole, you would need to check that measurement against your sleeve measurement. So what would you do if you had a great difference between the seams when you trued them together? It might be 3/4 of an inch to an inch, or greater, which is 2 to 2.5 centimetres. Then what you're going to need to do is to make an amendment at the top and at the bottom of the seam. So I would start by working my way from the bottom, or whichever way you want to start, up, and I would find out the difference. For an example, let's say that this seam had an inch, 2.5 centimetres of difference. What I would then do is, that's half an inch for the top and half an inch for the bottom, approximately 1.25 centimetres for the top and for the bottom. And what I would do in both of those locations is to choose the median point. So I would pick the average point here at my armhole curve, and I would need to re-blend the armhole curve in. I would do the same at the hem. I would have to pick that half inch point, and I would need to re-blend my hem. That's just something to think about if you do have a big amount of discrepancy. Again, once your seam is correct, then you could go ahead and add notches at the waist or put them in positions that you need to remember. Generally speaking, garments will have a single notch at the front and work their way around in the number of notches. So 2 notches will be on the side, perhaps 3 notches on the back. Another really important part of truing your seams together is to make sure that all of the transitions are smooth, that you blend any of the curves or shapes in the pattern, and that you don't have any peaks or troughs, dips or points basically of where the seams join. Now, a key area to think about this is the centre front or centre back. If you have a pattern piece that is going to be cut on the fold, that might be the front, that might be the back, that might be another area. You need to make sure that when you cut it on the fold, you are going to create a duplicate that isn't going to have a peak or a trough at the neck or at the hem. Now, a lot of the time, this will be referred to in pattern cutting books as making sure that you have a right angle. So making sure that at this neck area here, you have a right angle where the seam of the neck joins the centre back seam. The same would go for the hem. And again, I have a right angle there where the hem and the centre back seam join. So this is just something that you need to check and that you need to consider so that you don't get any dips or troughs. Almost always where your hems join, you need to have right angles. The same goes for where the side seams meet at a waist. Otherwise, you will have a seam that dips up or that dips down. Now, you also need to think about other joining areas, such as the armhole and the neck. And you again need to make sure that they're going to have a smooth transition from one pattern piece to the other. And if you don't, you put it right. Now, what I mean by a peak or a trough are that if these two seams were tilted down slightly, so they weren't flat, and I position them together, I would end up with a dip where they joined under the arm. And this just doesn't look nice. The opposite would happen. I'll do this one in red. If they were to come up a little bit, and again, this one comes up, and they would again have a peak. So that is a peak and that is a trough. Or that's what I call them anyway. A dip, a peak, it doesn't really matter. The same rules apply. The key is we do not want those. So we want to have our seams nice and flat. And we want to have a nice flat line going through the armhole. And we want that all the way around the armhole and any other curves that are connecting. Looking at the neckline and the armhole here, we want to make sure that we have a nice curve over the top of the armhole and around the neck. And when you're drafting, you always want to double check these things. So if I was drafting, I would be putting my pattern pieces together, abutting the edges of the paper. But I'm working with a pattern that already exists. So instead, I'm either putting one on top of each other with my stitching lines, or I could fold one stitching line back because this is a straight line and connect them like so. For this part of the exercise, I will tape them down. So we want to make sure we have a nice smooth join over the top of the shoulder here. So that's looking pretty good, but if I were to draw that in, I would say something like so. And then the same for my neck, and you can see that my neck is a little bit out here. So again, I would want to have a nice smooth line here, connecting everything together, just like so. And that is the case of truing those curves. And by making an adjustment to the original pattern, you may then find that you need to make an adjustment to your lining, to your facing, to all of the other connecting pieces. And that is part of the truing process. The final thing I would always check is that I was happy with the shape of any design lines and curves. Again, they should always be smooth. It's all about creating that smooth transition, the smooth seams that are going to sew together nicely, and that when you have sewn them together, you haven't got any dips, peaks, troughs, whatever we want to call them. Now, I thought it might also be interesting to see how I true a sleeve. So I'm going to be filming a how to true a sleeve tutorial, and that will launch on Tuesday. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial, that you now know how to true seams in the future and the rules that you need to apply. Thanks for watching and see you soon.